Oh, hello, and thank you so much for attending this special webinar on energy transition by Energize Consulting. My name is Quentin Crowe, and my role today is to introduce you to Dr. Charlotte Starkman. Energize Consulting was founded by Charlotte back in 2011 to support energy companies with their energy transition. Over the next 25 minutes or so, Charlotte will explore this one key issue. How ready are we to lead energy transition? Charlotte will provide an overview of the key insights from this year's survey, the challenges facing mature and new entrants in the market, and her thoughts and suggestions for business leaders. Before I hand over to Charlotte, we do need to cover a couple of very basic housekeeping points. The first is that the slides that she'll be sharing will be made available to you all. And the second is that there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any questions that you might like to raise. So a little more background about today's speaker. Charlotte has over 20 years experience in the energy sector, starting as a petroleum engineer with Shell. She has blue chip experience in business transition and organizational development projects with the likes of IBM, PwC, Charlotte, and Arthur D. Little. So we're definitely in good hands. Her expertise, or her main expertise, is helping energy companies both scale up their operations effectively and to help them develop their growth plans in the context of a sustainable organization. This webinar summarizes the key insights from the second industry-wide survey the energy consultancy team have conducted on energy transition. Charlotte, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Quentin. And it's great to see everyone on the call. I'm very excited to launch the 2022 report. Particularly as we all know that the energy transition is challenging and we yet don't have all the solutions to it. I really love this quote from Barack Obama, which is, "The path towards sustainable energy sources will be long and sometimes difficult, but we cannot resist it, we must lead it." And I think that's the crux of what I want to cover today. Is I will go through all the insights, but really what practical solutions can we do to take this forward? And that's what I'll be covering today. Before I go into the detail of the report, just to give you some headlines, I'm going to cover off the high level trends coming from the report. I'm going to cover off what the challenges are people see for mature energy companies, and I'm defining mature energy companies here as the incumbents in the sector, so the big IOCs, the utility companies, the companies people know and love. I'm also going to talk about some of the challenges for the new entrants. Those are the new renewable companies coming in, hydrogen companies, etc. Then I'll touch on what people see individuals doing, and then I'll end by talking about what the readiness of the industry is like. So without further ado, let me start by talking you through the report. Here we go. So what are the survey results for 2002? The two key things that stood out to me was, firstly, there has been a drop in confidence from participants in how they feel the doability of the energy transition is, from 75% to 50%. At the same time, what's very encouraging is that participants feel more confidence in the industry leaders to actually deliver the transition. While at first look, it might be concerning that there has been a drop in confidence in how people feel it is to deliver the transition. Actually, if you look at the broader figures, for example, there's a survey that Capita ran of the general population, and the general population only 18% of people are confident in the doability of the transition. So from these figures, what it looks like is the energy industry is starting to understand the complexities of the transition and understand and become a bit more realistic about this. And this is probably driven through a lot of the challenges we saw last year around Ukraine, energy prices, energy security, etc. And I think this is a good thing, because I think the industry itself has for many years found technology to be the solution to many of the challenges. And while technology is part of the energy transition solution, it's not the only part, and it will become societal change and behavioural change will be a big part of this transition. And that's something that makes this transition interesting and challenging at the same time. The other key statistic here is around middle management. From the survey, it's clear that middle management are significantly less confident than new managers, new people who've been in the sector a short period of time, and senior managers. This doesn't come as a surprise to me, as this is very typical of many organisations that are going through transition projects. And in fact, this gap between senior managers and middle management is often a reason why 80% of business transformations fail. And clearly the energy transition isn't something that we can fail at. So what does that all mean? And what, as leaders in the sector, should we be thinking about? I think the first thing to say is we are getting to a more realistic view of the transition, which is a positive thing, because then we can actually start working on practical solutions. The second thing is leaders are well regarded and have the opportunity. So let us all capitalise on this and accelerate the change. The key thing for leaders to focus on is middle management, and that is around working with it to engage and understand what are their concerns, what are the barriers, what are the levers within that to drive the change. Also being realistic about the degree of change. Often within the middle management group, there is so many initiatives going on, there's so much work. Middle managements have seen this before. They know what works, they don't work, but they're often not consulted, and there's too many things going on. So one of the key things I often say to people is, what are you going to stop? Because you can't keep just adding activity. What's the stuff that needs to stop in order to accelerate this? And as a last point, think about some fresh ideas into this cohort, things like reverse mentoring, getting younger people, getting also potentially, I'll go on and talk about it, but there are new entrants into the sectors, getting them to be mentored by people who've been 20 years in the sector to get an exchange of ideas. So there we are. We've started to talk about how the industry is changing, and over the last years we have started to see significant investment in renewables and other energy transition projects. In fact, at the beginning of this year, Bloomberg announced for the first time there'd been a record investment of 1.1 trillion globally that had been invested in energy transition. And what's very interesting is, for the first time, that's actually matched the investment in fossil fuels. Equally, we've seen a shift to renewables, an 18% growth in 2023. What does this mean for the sector? There are two key challenges here. One is, how do mature companies transition their commercial model from their legacy assets, their legacy model, and the skills and experience they have to this new business? And the second challenge is, how do new entrants in the market take advantage of the growth opportunities so they can scale up their opportunities, and also in a changing market? And before I continue, I'm actually going to ask for your participation here, if I can get this poll working, and get your input into what you think the mature companies are doing. So I'll launch, what I'd like you to have a think about is, what do you think mature energy companies are doing? Are they investing enough in the energy transition? What do you think? Not enough? About right? Not sure? not enough viable investments for them, because obviously there's got to be enough there, or too much. So I'll give us a couple of minutes for people to get their fingers on buttons and see where we are. So I think we're stabilizing there, and it looks like we've got 35%. Where are we? So I think people are. So I think people are here saying not enough, but we're not actually sure there's enough viable investments for them. So that's quite an interesting poll here. So I'll just end the poll here, and we'll go on and start talking about what the survey said. Let me stop sharing this. What the survey said about mature energy companies. Next slide, if I can get this to work. Yeah, here we go. So what people said around mature energy companies is broadly, they saw most people focused on producing oil and gas and generating energies whilst looking for ways to minimize the footprint. And a lot of respondents, like yourself on the poll, were saying they felt there should be more investment on renewables in clean tech and technology. However, I think there is this challenge on, are there sufficient investments out there for the sector to invest in, because we're still at an early stage. What's interesting, going back to Bloomberg's analysis of the investment situation, their view was that we needed to triple the investment globally to get back on track for net zero. So that's a very interesting statistic. And my challenge really is, you know, if that's the case, what could your business look like if you were able to triple the investment that you have now in energy transition projects? So whilst we think about that, let me talk about what people thought the challenges were in the survey and comparing that to last year in mature companies. Broadly, the three core challenges were the same as last year, which was around how we shift our operating model. And that's very much about the commercials and how we move people around. Linked to that is also faster decision making, because there is a difference between legacy oil and gas and renewables and some of these growing EV markets, etc., that requires a different type of decision making, and also learning different technologies. And they were roughly about the same. However, there were some differences, and I think one of the things I'd like to pick out here is there has been an increase in the challenges adapting to people coming from other industries. And I think what's very interesting is this year I started to see more people who were working with people outside the sector, and I'll come on and talk about that later in the presentation. So what does that mean in terms of mature companies that leaders need to consider? Firstly, be very careful of greenwashing. There's a lot of talk at the moment, but now increasingly there is the requirement to measure and report against what you've said, and that it will be picked up if you don't deliver on what you've said. This has been seen this week with BP's results, and it's been noticed that they have reduced the target for how much their emissions that they are going to produce from their oil and gas production. In other words, they're actually increasing their CO2 emissions because they're increasing oil and gas production. And that has been noted. So don't rely on rhetoric, and be aware that it will be picked up, and you need to be clear on why you're doing, why, if you change, because we are in a transition, so things change, why that's happening. Operating models are going to change through the transition, as I've already touched upon. And leaders can be proactive and accelerate the transition and reduce the pain and cost by being proactive about their operating models and plan for the future. And those that do will really be able to take a step on their peers. So what should people be doing? Looking at your current operating model. What are the barriers, pain points, and levers in the current organization? What is your operating model of the future? And what are the steps to transition to that? Things like, what does that mean for assets that are coming to end of life? They need to be operated differently. What does that mean for your organization model? What does that mean for your operating model? What does that mean for your cost base? Really thinking through that and getting to a point where you say, where is the decision point for this? When do we make that transition? Secondly, thinking about how do you set up for the future. A number of companies are starting to actually change their operating model now and create separate organizations that are just skills-based, which allow them to put resources across the different businesses. So for example, in an oil company, in upstream, and focus in renewables without being tied to a particular business, which means you don't get the conflict between the business and what's best for the individual businesses and what's best for the overall businesses. Thirdly, one of the key things around here is the speed of change. Many companies who have been through, like we are experiencing here, external changes to the environment don't move quickly enough. And there are a number of MBA case studies to prove that. For example, Blockbuster, who thought Netflix was a flash in the pan, who used to rent out videos, who knows who Blockbuster is now, and who in this room actually isn't a subscriber to Netflix. Another big one is Kodak, the film company. They actually had their biggest successful amount of sales in their film business the year before they went bankrupt. They were the company that actually invented the digital camera in the 70s, and they had a massive investment in digital cameras. What they failed to see was the advent of smartphones and photo sharing. Imagine if they had, and potentially had, a joint venture with Facebook, that would be a very different company instead. Instead, they didn't invest significantly in the growth business, as they were very worried about cannibalizing their existing sales. And I think that's something, as a message, we need to take on board. On a more positive note, we can also look at the transition that Ørsted has made from Dong, a very heavy fossil fuel company, and how they've managed it. And two of the key learnings that's come from them is, one, the change is exponential and leaders need to work very hard to stay ahead of the change and lead the change. And the other very interesting thing that they learned is the transition happens a lot quicker than you planned for it. They had originally planned to do the transition in 30 years. They did it in less than a decade. So a couple of things to think about as leaders in this sector. And two points, practical points here to focus on is, one, I started mentioning it in the operating model, thinking about how do you allocate your resources, because it's difficult when you're allocating to a new area that has an unproven commercial model, and particularly technology that you're not quite sure, versus existing highly profitable ventures. Make sure you have mechanisms to allow equal spread and equal, not just money, but people. And secondly, remember the staff on the legacy assets. They're key to this transition. Make sure they feel valued, because they're the ones that are really going to come up and solve the problems for you. And lastly, but by no means leastly, is culture change. There is a big culture change happening in the sector. We are starting to getting an influx of people from all different sectors. In fact, I've spoken to recruiters and they are very surprised that people are now approaching them because they want to join the sector, and not just young people, but people with experience, which would never have happened before. And this is because they're driven by purpose. They want to make a difference for the change and they want to be part of this. So, and we also as an industry have people that have been in the sector 20+ years, myself included, and many of those have worked for the same company. So bringing these people together, a lot of work needs to be done to include people and prevent cultural clash. I've seen within companies new people who've got an entrepreneurial scope, well, let's try this, let's try that, with people who've been there in the company 20 years and like, well, we've done this, and managing that, because the people that will make a difference will be the people that have got these two types of people working together in diverse teams. Diverse teams are not easy to manage and they need a lot of work. However, they are very high performing, and we need these teams to actually come up with the solutions that we yet haven't found. And that also ties into decision making, making sure you've got the best group of people to get that diverse thinking to come up with the best solutions. So a lot on that slide. Let's start looking at, having touched on, we've got new people coming into the industry. What does that mean for, what are we seeing about that? What did people think? Do they think it's easy for people to join the industry? Broadly, they felt it was about 6 out of 10, and interestingly, 63% of respondents are actually working with people new to the sector. So this is a change this year. It also, so what should leaders be thinking about it? I've touched on inclusion on the last slide. I think the key takeaway from leaders here is, particularly as we've seen the confidence in the doability of transition dropping overall in the sector, there is a risk as people join the sector full of enthusiasm and they start to understand more about the challenge and more the difficulties, they might get discouraged. And this is where leaders can step in and help them and encourage them and keep them engaging in their role, and so that they can really see how their role aligns to making a difference. So let's now talk about these new entrants, so the renewable companies, hydrogen companies. What did people feel the challenges were for them? Clearly, the biggest thing here was around demonstrating returns and establishing them as being credible in the sector. This is a big thing, particularly as the market's changing. If you look, for example, at the challenges on the EVs, they had a huge, that they were really growing last year. That growth has dampened because of the increase in energy prices. So how do you run a business where things are changing? One of the things to really focus on is take time out and actually look at the whole business. I recently did this with the CEO, stepped through his strategy, what his operating model looked like, what his growth plans looked like. And he found that incredibly valuable, because he started to see he was only focusing on the short term, which is a lot of these companies are doing, rather than focusing on the medium and long term. And we picked up a couple of key actions for him. One was he was building his leadership team, but he was realized that he only was focusing on what he needed now. He hadn't actually looked at what he needed for the medium and long term. So he's had to rejig what he was planning to do there. Also, as he's growing his organization, he also realized he needed a much better performance management system to actually be able to manage people and set things up now right, so that it can grow with the business. So what does that mean for individuals? This is a very busy slide. However, the cool thing here is that individuals are getting more clarity on what their role is in the energy transition, and they are taking a lot of time to actually develop their career and working out what it means for them. What's very interesting is organisations appear to be spending less time supporting those individuals. There's a lot of work on sharing strategy so that people understand where the business is going, but how that's translating to individuals seems to be there's less effort. And in fact, 17% of companies, respondents said 17% of people said companies weren't doing enough. And I think the challenge here for leaders in the sectors is that right? Should we be doing more? And on this slide here, there's some further thoughts on what people can be doing. And I think one of the things I've seen people do very well is actually just highlight, as the path isn't that clear, people who have done energy transition careers, because that's very helpful for people to start thinking about, so what does that mean for me? So how ready are we in the sector? The good news is the respondents of the survey felt we'd had an increase in readiness as a sector since last year, which is good news. Overall, people feel we're more ready as an industry than people are as an individual. So there is still work to be done on those areas. And also this is very much in, we're starting to get ready. So there still is a long way to go. So let me sum up now, as I've been talking for quite some time, around what leaders need to take away. Key message here is people now have increased confidence in their leaders to make this energy transition. So as leaders, let's capitalize on it. The transition is now. Are you moving fast, and how can you move faster? Take the lessons from Ørsted, look at what we need to be doing from an investment point of view, and what can you do? So what are the key pain points that I've been talking about through the survey? Firstly, what is your operating model? How does that need to change? How will you engage your middle management? How do you ensure balanced allocation of resources in the transition? And how do you plan to support your people's development through the transition? And before we go into Q&A, I'm just going to run another poll, if I can find it again, because I'd be interested to know what of those, what the priorities are for you, for your organisation around that. So what action do you think your organisation should take first? Run a diagnostic on the operating model, survey the middle management to assess engagement and readiness to change, assess the investment decision making and resourcing, or build career paths? What do you think? So I'll give it a couple more minutes on this. So broadly, I'll end the poll now before anyone else makes it. So broadly, what people fundamentally see here is it's about the investment decision making and how opportunities are resourced, which I think is a very interesting take, followed by the operating model diagnostics. So thank you for that.